2. The structure of war, the juxtaposition of injured bodies and unanchored issues. Torture is such an extreme event that it seems inappropriate to generalize from it to anything else or from anything else to it. Its immorality is so absolute and the pain it brings about so real that there is a reluctance to place it in conversation by the side of other subjects. But this reluctance, and the deep sense of tact in which it originates, increase our vulnerability to power by ensuring that our moral intuitions and impulses, which come forward so readily on behalf of human sentience, do not come forward far enough to be of any help. We are most backward on behalf of the things we believe in, most in part because, like ancients hesitant to permit analogies to God, our instincts salute the incommensurability of pain by preventing its entry into worldly discourse. The result of this is that the very moral intuitions that might act on behalf of the claims of sentience remain almost as interior and inarticulate as sentience itself. It is a consequence of the ease with which power can be mixed with almost any other subject that it can be endlessly unfolded, exfoliated, in strategies and theories that, whether compellingly legitimate or transparently absurd in their very form, in the very fact of occurring in human speech, increase the claim of power, its representation in the world. In contrast, one of two things is true of pain. Either it remains inarticulate, or else the moment it first becomes articulate it silences all else. The moment language bodies forth the reality of pain, it makes all further statements and interpretations seem ludicrous and inappropriate, as hollow as the world content that disappears in the head of the person suffering. Beside the initial fact of pain, all further elaborations that it violates this or that human principle, that it can be objectified in this or that way, that it is amplified here, that it is disguised there, all these seem trivializations, a missing of the point, a missing of the pain. But the result of this is that the moment it is lifted out of the ironclad privacy of the body into speech, it immediately falls back in. Nothing sustains its image in the world, nothing alerts us to the place it has vacated. From the inarticulate it half emerges into speech and then quickly recedes once more. Invisible in part because of its resistance to language, it is also invisible because its own powerfulness ensures its isolation, ensures that it will not be seen in the context of other events, that it will fall back from its new arrival in language and remain devastating. Its absolute claim for acknowledgement contributes to its being ultimately unacknowledged. Though there may be no human event that is as without defense as torture, others give rise to the same central question: by what perceptual process does it come about that one human being can stand beside another human being in agonizing pain and not know it to the point where he himself inflicts it, and once again lead to an answer centering on interactions between the body and voice made possible by a language of agency. The most obvious analog to torture is war. The form of torture that leaves the prisoner untouched by the torturer but that requires prisoners to maim one another makes visible the connection between them. Some of the apparent difference between them are partially attributable to the fact that the symbolic and the fictional are much more prominent in torture. War more often arises where the enemy is external, occupies a separate space, where the impulse to obliterate a rival population and its civilization is not, or need not at first be perceived as, a self-destruction. Torture usually occurs where the enemy is internal and where the destruction of a race and its civilization would be a self-destruction, an obliteration of one's own country. Hence there must be more drama in torture, the destruction must be acted out symbolically one within a handful of rooms. War and torture have the same two targets, a people and its civilization, or as they were called earlier, the two realms of sentience and self-extension. The much greater reliance on the symbolic in torture occurs in both spheres. In both war and torture, there is a destruction of civilization in its most elemental form. When Berlin is bombed, when Dresden is burned, there is a deconstruction not only of a particular ideology but of the primary evidence of the capacity for self-extension itself. One does not in bombing Berlin destroy only objects, gestures, and thoughts that are culturally stipulated, but objects, gestures, and thoughts that are human, not Dresden buildings or German architecture but human shelter. Torture is a parallel act of deconstruction. It imitates the destructive power of war. Rather than destroying the concrete physical fact of streets, houses, factories, and schools, it destroys them as they exist in the mind of the prisoner. It destroys them as they exist in the furnishings of a room. To convert a table into a weapon is to set a factory on fire. To hear a confession is to watch from above the explosion of a city block. This same form of substitution occurs in relation to the second target, the sentient source of the first, the human body itself. Whereas the object of war is to kill people, torture usually mimes the killing of people by inflicting pain, the sensory equivalent of death, substituting prolonged mock execution for execution. The numbers involved reinforce the sense of the division between the real and the dramatized. Although the thousands and thousands of political prisoners hurt during the 1970s and 1980s have led Amnesty International to call torture an epidemic, the numbers of persons hurt are of course vastly larger in war. In torture, the individual stands for individuals. Huge multiplicity is replaced by close proximity sustained over hours or days or weeks. Being in close contact with the victims hurt provides the sense of magnitude achieved in war through large numbers. But while torture relies much more heavily on overt drama than does war too, as is quietly registered in the language of theaters of battle, international dialogues, scenarios, and stages, has within it a large element of the symbolic and is ultimately, like torture, based on a simple and startling blend of the real and the fictional. In each, the incontestable reality of the body in pain, the body maimed, the body dead and hard to dispose of, is separated from its source and conferred on an ideology or issue or instance of political authority impatient of, or deserted by, benign sources of substantiation. There is no advantage to settling an international dispute by means of war rather than by a song contest or a chess game, except that in the moment when the contestants step out of the song contest, it is immediately apparent that the outcome was arrived at by a series of rules that were agreed to and that can now be disagreed. 2. A series of rules whose force of reality cannot survive the end of the contest. Because that reality was brought about by human acts of participation and is dispelled when the participation ceases. The rules of war are equally arbitrary and again depend on convention, agreement, and participation, but the legitimacy of the outcome outlives the end of the contest because so many of its participants are frozen in a permanent act of participation. That is, the winning issue or ideology achieves for a time the force and status of material fact by the sheer material weight of the multitudes of damaged and opened human bodies. This brief characterization of the structure of war will be unfolded more slowly below and then differentiated from a widely accepted and erroneous account of war with which it might otherwise be confused. Gradually the parallel between what occurs in the interior of torture and what occurs in the interior of war will become visible, as will also a crucial element that differentiates them, endowing war with a moral ambiguity wholly absent from torture. It will become clear why those who wish to outlaw torture have never found it difficult to arrive at an absolute formulation of their prohibition, while those who with equal passion work to outlaw the initiation of war have so often stopped short of an unconditional formulation and arrived at the perception that an absolute prohibition may be itself morally untenable. Point 2. One simple and important formal difference will be visible from the outset. Though the two are structural analogues, the fundamental shape of each comes into being in a different place. The structure of torture resides in, takes shape in, The physical and verbal interactions between two persons, a torturer and a pre-warner. The structure of war will again be centered in an extraordinary relation between body and voice, but that relation will not be itself locatable within the relation between any two persons, soldier and officer, soldier and civilian nor even in the relation between two large groups of people, such as the hundreds of thousands of persons who face and to face each other across the field of battle. Point 3. The essential structure of war, its juxtaposition of the extreme facts of body and voice, resides in the relation between its own largest parts, the relation between the collective casualties that occur within war, and the verbal issues, freedom, national sovereignty, the right to a disputed ground, the extraterritorial authority of a particular ideology, that stand outside war, that are there before the act of war begins and after it ends, that are understood by warring populations as the motive and justification and will again be recognized after the war as the thing substantiated war, if one is on the losing side. Not substantiated by war's activity. The central question that is asked here, what is the relation between the obsessive act of injuring and the issue on behalf of which that act is performed, is a question about the relation between the interior content of war and what stands outside it. In order to answer that question, however, it is necessary to back up one step to define the relation between two interior facts about war. First, that the immediate activity is injuring. Second, that the immediate activity of war is a contest. In participating in war, one participates not simply in an act of injuring, but in the activity of reciprocal injuring, where the goal is to out-injure the opponent. The construction, war is ch2, has, over the centuries, invited an array of predicate nominatives, but there are no two predicate nominatives that have either the accuracy or the definitional totality as the two singled out here, and it is by first understanding precisely how the two qualify one another that it will be possible to arrive at an understanding of the second and more fundamental question about the relation between bodily injury and verbal issues. Our starting place, then, is the assumption that war belongs to two larger categories of human experience, larger in the sense that each contains war as only one of its terms. First, it is a form of violence, it is a member of a class of occurrences whose activity is injuring. Second, it is a member of a class of occurrences that are contests. It is in the relation of these two rather than in either individually that the nature of war resides, but for a moment each of the two must be held steadily visible in isolation because each has a way of slipping out of view. Thus it is necessary to back up one more step and make certain that our two self-evident premises are indeed self-evident. War is injuring. The main purpose and outcome of war is injuring. Though this fact is too self-evident and massive ever to be directly contested, it can be indirectly contested by many means and disappear from view along many separate paths. It may disappear from view simply by being omitted. One can read many pages of a historic or strategic account of a particular military campaign, or listen to many successive installments in a newscast narrative of events in a contemporary war, without encountering the acknowledgement that the purpose of the event described is to alter, to burn, to blast, to shell, to cut human tissue, as well as to alter the surface, shape, and deep entirety of the objects that human beings recognize as extensions of themselves. In any given instance, omission may occur out of the sense that this activity is too self-evident to require articulation. It may instead originate in a failure of perception on the part of the describer. Again, it may arise out of an active desire to misrepresent the central content of war's activity, and this conscious attempt to misrepresent can in its turn be broken down into an array of motives, some malevolent, some relatively benign. The identification of the paths by which injuring disappears from view and not the identification of motive will be attended to here, for any one path is likely to be laden with many motives, and the recitation of all of them in so brief a discussion would be as impossible as the specification of one or two would be misleading. Much more important, regardless of local motives, the structure of war itself will require that injuring be partially eclipsed from view and will invariably bring about that eclipse by one constellation of motives or another. That is, just as torture can be understood to entail three separate steps: the infliction of pain, the objectification of the pain, the disowning of the pain and transfer of its attributes to another location, so, too, it will gradually become evident that war entails a similar structure of physical and perceptual events. It requires both the reciprocal infliction of massive injury and the eventual disowning of the injury so that its attributes can be transferred elsewhere, as they cannot if they are permitted to cling to the original site of the wound, the human body. It should also be noticed from the outset that while the perpetuation of war would be impossible without the disowning of injuring, this disowning is not necessarily authored, not at any rate exclusively authored, by those who wish to perpetuate war. Although it would not be inaccurate to say that in general the physical immediacy of damaged human bodies is more visible in the words of those working to outlaw a particular weapon, to stop a particular war, or to eliminate the universal form of war than it is in the words of those who, because of a political or military or philosophic position, are engaged in its continuation, the generalization would be one so elaborately attended by qualifications and exceptions that it would come to seem unhelpful if not untrue. The qualifications come from three directions. First, active opposition to war does not necessarily require an accurate perception or description of the relation between injuring and political goals. Second, and conversely, acceptance of war, or even active sponsorship of war as occurs when a president, prime minister, or statesman must work to ensure the continued participation of his country's population in a given conflict, may in fact be carried out, as can be seen in the political writings of Henry Kissinger and Winston Churchill, or again in the strategic writings of Clausewitz, Liddell Hart, or Sokolovsky, with varying degrees of attention to and assessment of the centrality of the act of injuring. Third, conventional war entails the participation of a massive number of people, only a small fraction of whom are engaged in the active verbal advocacy of either the elimination or the perpetuation of war, and if injuring disappears, it is its absence in their informal conversation that is perhaps most important. A deeply tactful, compassionate, and careful account of the alterations that occur in human tissue, such as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's verbal and visual account of the effects of incendiary weapons in Vietnam, Dresden, Hiroshima, or Nagasaki, may place the injured body several inches in front of our eyes, hold the light up to the injured flesh, and keep steady the reader's head so that he cannot turn away. Point 4. In their attempt to bring about the elimination of such weapons may be differentiated not by whether or not they injure, nor even by the final extremity of damage since most kill, but by the intensity and duration of suffering before death. Such descriptions are crucial, for although in understanding the nature of war the agonized injury of the small Vietnamese girl's burned face and burned off arms or later her look of terror as she sees in the reflecting surface of window, river, or imported spoon, the obliteration of her features must be multiplied over the thousands and millions of inhabitants of different countries. Injury must at some point be understood individually because pain, like all forms of sentience, is experienced within, happens within, the body of the individual. Such a study may not, however, specify whether such injury was the intent or accidental effect of the bombing, whether it was within or wholly outside the view of the chemist or corporation who discovered or marketed napalm, and, most important, whether the populations who consented to war consented to this or to something else. A much more direct account of these questions may occur in writings that endorse, or at least accept, the occurrence of war. Of all writing, political, strategic, historical, medical, there is probably no work that more successfully holds visible the structural spirituality of injuring than Clausewitz's on war. In his description of invasion, for example, he will say, the immediate object here is neither to conquer the enemy country nor to destroy its army, but simply to cause general damage, as he will often elsewhere specify that the object is to increase the enemy's suffering 5 in battle. For example, the soldier's primary goal is not, as is so often wrongly implied, the protection or defense of his comrades. If it were this, he would have led those comrades to another geography. His primary purpose is the injuring of enemy soldiers. To preserve his own forces has the important but only secondary and negative purpose of frustrating and exhausting the opponent's achievement of his goal. Point 6. If the visibility of the central fact of damage, and the specification of the particular form of damage sought in any given tactic, has wrongly contributed to Clausewitz's reputation for ruthlessness, it has justly contributed to his reputation for astonishing brilliance. One knows on every page that one is in the presence of a massive intelligence, in part because his powers of description remain available to him at all moments. The written and spoken record of war over many centuries certifies the ease with which human powers of description break down in the presence of battle, the speed with which they back away from injuring and begin to take as their subject the most incidental or remote activities occurring there, rather than holding on to what is everywhere occurring at its center and periphery. The enumeration of the paths by which injuring disappears from view only begins with the one already named here, omission. The character of the other paths will be illustrated below with passages from formal writings, but they are most significant insofar as they are recognized as having counterparts in the informal and unrecorded conversations of the general population, as the subject of war makes its way into our daily activities and accompanies us as we walk down the road, sit down to dinner, or return a borrowed book or tool to a friend. A second path by which injuring disappears is the active redescription of the event. The act of injuring, or the tissue that is to be injured, or the weapon that is to accomplish the injury is renamed. The gantry for American missiles is named the Cherry Picker. 7. Just as American missions entailing the massive dropping of incendiary bombs over North Vietnam were called Sherwood Forest and Pink Rose. 8. Just as Japanese suicide planes in World War II were called Night Blossoms. 9. As prisoners subjected to medical experiments in Japanese camps were called logs. 10. And as the day during World War I on which 30,000 Russians and 13,000 Germans died at Tannenberg came to be called the day of harvesting. 11. The recurrence here of language from the realm of vegetation occurs because vegetable tissue, though alive, is perceived to be immune to pain, thus the inflicting of damage can be read histored in language without permitting the entry of the reality of suffering into the description. Live vegetable tissue occupies a peculiar category of sentience that is close to, perhaps is, non-sentience. More often, the language is drawn from the unequivocal non-sentience of steel, wood, iron, and aluminum, the metals and materials out of which weapons are made and which can be invoked, so that an event entailing two deeply traumatic occurrences, the inflicting of an injury and the receiving of an injury, is thus neutralized. Point 12. Neutralization or neutering, or there are many variants such as cleaning, cleaning out, cleaning up. 13. Or other phrases indicating an alteration in an essential characteristic of the metal, such as eckification, is itself a major vocabulary invoked in the redescription of injuring. It begins by being applied only to weapons. It is the other people's firepower, guns, rockets, tanks, that must be neutralized, but it is then transferred to the holder of the gun, the firer of the rocket, the driver of the tank, as well as to the civilian sister of the holder, the uncle of the firer, the child of the driver, the who. Man beings who must be, not injured or burned or dismembered or killed but, neutralized, cleaned out, liquidated. Although a weapon is an extension of the human body, as is acknowledged in their collective designation as arms, it is instead the human body that becomes in this vocabulary an extension of the weapon. A 19-year-old holding a pistol has an arm that is 3.5 feet from his shoulder to the tip of his weapon. If the weapon is firing, his reach changes from 3.5 feet to 500 yards. The first 3 feet are sentient tissue, the last half foot is non-sentient material. An idiom appropriate to an alteration in the surface of the gun's metal is invoked to describe an alteration in the boy's embodied arm as, conversely, an idiom originally invented to describe an unwanted alteration in the tissue of the human arm will be extended to the weapon, so an opponent will find himself in the peculiar position of working to neutralize the boy and to wound the gun. That the wounding language is applied to weapons and arms, that helicopters are injured in the sands of Iran, that the Sheffield receives a mortal wound in the waters off the Falkland Islands, would not in isolation be wholly inappropriate, since these objects, like libraries and cities, are projections of the human person, but the language is lent to the weapons at precisely the same moment that it is being lifted away from the sentient source of those projections. The language of killing and injuring ceases to be a morally resonant one because the successful shelling of the bodies of thousands of 19-year-old German soldiers can be called producing results 14, and the death of civilians by starvation and pestilence following an economic boycott is called collateral effects 15. At precisely the same time that one turns on a radio and hears the report of an arsenal of tanks that received a massive injury, or opens a book and reads about the government's hope to kill a hidden base. 16. Once the populations of two nations consent to devote themselves to damaging each other, the dissolution of their language may not be itself morally disastrous, it may be perceived as inevitable and perhaps even necessary. These difficult questions are neither raised nor answered here, where the object is the relatively modest one of registering two facts, that reciprocal injuring is the obsessive content of war, that its centrality often slips from viewpoint. 17. The habit of mind that is illustrated here as occurring in representative phrases and sentences is a massive one that occurs not in isolated fragments but is formalized into a conventional mode of perceiving the events of war. The exchange of idioms between weapons and bodies has its most serious manifestation in the fact that in many different contexts 18 the central interactivity of war comes to be identified as, or described as though it were, disarming rather than injuring. Although the first term is sometimes intended only as a synonym for the second. 19. It is at other times used explicitly to differentiate the benign activity of eliminating weapons from what is then presented as the only accidental and unfortunate entailment of human injury during those operations. Thus we repeatedly encounter descriptions of war that come astonishingly close in their expressed aversion to weapons to sounding not merely protective but merely pacifist in intention. If this confusion has achieved monumental proportions in discussions of nuclear war, it is because our very conception of nuclear war may itself be understood as the culmination of the history of this confusion. It is appropriate that at precisely the moment when weapons are capable of unprecedented injury to the human body, 300 million persons in the first exchange, and in fact incapable of not inflicting that massive injury, if shot down outside one's own territory they will land In someone's country, it is appropriate that at precisely this moment those weapons should have names, example anti-missile missile, and be consistently described in such a way that their only target, or only intended target, or only immediate target, appears to be another weapon, that their effect is to disarm rather than to injure. 20 It should be understood that the coupling of the two is not an accidental and ironic conjunction but a profound manifestation of a confusion, with a long and rich history. In the history of thinking about war, there are probably only one or two other errors at once so persistent, pervasive, and deeply wrong as this one. It is of course precisely because conventional war does in fact include in its interior acts of disarming. A dead soldier may be called a disarmed soldier even though his rifle is still functional, and in any war there may be many specific missions that have as their target the destruction of a munitions works, a tractor factory, or an opal plant. That this particular confusion is more difficult to correct than the parallel confusion that involves importing an occurrence outside war into its interior. That is, a person who believes, perhaps quite rightly, that the outcome of a particular war will be greater political freedom for a given population may wrongly think of the interior activity of war as freeing. But if actually asked to look at several hundred people in a forest slipping behind trees, edging out, lifting a rifle, disappearing, reappearing, bleeding, falling, he would probably agree that the best identification of the immediate activity occurring there would not be freeing, but reciprocal injuring. Although the exterior occurrence may be imported into his description of the interior, he may begin by describing the activity as freeing but then see that those men whose actions he wants to describe as oppressing are performing a nearly identical set of gestures. It can still be clearly differentiated from and abstracted back out of what literally occurs there. But any activity that itself actually occurs in the interior of war will be much more difficult for the human mind to assess. Because disarming and injuring accompany one another inside war, it is more difficult for a person watching the men, as they still slip through the light and shade of the forest, all shooting at one another, and all working to get to one of two stockpiles of ammunition that each side knows the other has, to see which activity is central and which is the extension of that center. If the observer were to identify the central act as injuring, the accuracy of this identification would be confirmed by the similarity between the infliction of injuring here and any instance of it occurring outside war. It might be with a car rather than a tank, a knife rather than a gun, down the steps rather than off a cliff, in solitude rather than in the company of thousands performing the same act, punishable as a crime or exonerated as self-defense rather than accepted as an unremarkable day's work, but in each case a body is being damaged by another body who himself risks danger at the moment he attempts to remain immune. If the observer were instead to identify the central activity as disarming, he or she would discover little similarity between the immediate activity of the men in the forest and the signing of a disarmament treaty between nations, or the signing of a contract between rival residents of adjoining streets. It could be argued that just as the original observer could describe the immediate activity as freeing if he agreed to call it freeing by injuring, or freeing by injuring those who are oppressing by injuring, or reciprocal injuring for non-reciprocal outcomes, so the second could call the activity disarming if he stipulated disarming by injuring and thus accounted for the profound difference between what is happening here and in a disarmament contract, where it is the very absence of injury that is the motivating force and outcome. But again, unless both terms are understood as synonyms, the phrase disarming by injuring still misrepresents war's activity by misidentifying injuring as the subordinate activity. The more accurate formulation of both the substance and purpose of that activity is not to disarm by injuring but to out-injure by injuring and disarming. That is, each side works to out-injure the other and does so in two ways. First, by inflicting injury on the bodies of the opponent. Second, by resisting injuries to themselves both by avoiding bullets, running, ducking, diving behind trees, all of which can be called acts of disarming or rendering neutral the enemy's weapons, and by destroying the munitions works or ammunition supplies. To say that each side in a war wishes to disarm the other only expresses the fact that each side wishes to increase its own immunity while inflicting damage on the other. 21 This particular confusion is so fundamental that its clarification will again be required at several later points in this discussion. It is introduced here because renaming injuring disarming is one of many ways in which injuring is redescribed and made invisible. The first two paths by which injuring achieves invisibility, omission and redecryption, are, of course, nearly inseparable. They are manifestations of one another. Redecryption may, for example, be understood as only a more active form of omission, rather than leaving out the fact of bodily damage. That fact is itself included and actively cancelled out as it is introduced into the spoken sentence or begins to be recorded on a written page. Alternatively, omission may be understood as only the most successful or extreme form of redecryption, where the fact of injury is now so successfully enfolded within the language that we cannot even sense its presence beneath the surface of that language, or point to the phrase or clause where, as in redecryption, it has almost surfaced and then been held in place once more. The difficulty of distinguishing the two can be illustrated by a particular formal convention that occurs within the genre of strategy writing. With the exception of periodic body counts or kill ratios, 22 the intricacies and complications of the massive geographical interactions between two armies of opposing nations tend to be represented without frequent reference to the actual injuries occurring to die hundreds of thousands of soldiers involved. The movements and actions of the armies are emptied of human content and occur as a rarefied choreography of disseminated events. But the quality of abstraction and, above all, the apparent distance of these events from the realm of human pain cannot in any simple way be attributed to the categorical evacuation of the body from the text, for the body, exiled in its ordinary form, is allowed to re-enter in an only slightly unexpected place. Each of the two armies periodically becomes a single embodied component, with the real human body's elemental duality of being at once capable of inflicting injury, and of receiving it. The ordinary 5 to 6 foot vertical expanse of the adult person now becomes a colossus with, for example, 1 foot in Italy, another in northern Africa, a head in Sweden, an arm pulling back toward the coast of France, then suddenly plunging forward toward Germany. The crossing of a river is not now an event enacted by many individuals, some of whom know how to swim and others of whom do know, some vulnerable to wet and cold and some relatively immune, some who have as their worst dream being caught between two banks on a bridge and others who have waited for just this moment of trial are but is rather enacted by a single integrated creature who, if named, takes the name of the division or of the commander, and who steps across in a single step as when Omar Bradley Rice Simpson had previously complained of Monty's orders halting him on the west bank of the Rhine when he could have jumped across it against light opposition. 23 Or, similarly, in stalking us through the Ardennes, the enemy had been forced to expose himself to our fire, especially to the murderous airburst of our proximity fuse. To the 4th Division still nursing its wounds from the work in forest, this reversal in roles brought a sardonic satisfaction. 24 If such descriptions were sustained over pages or even whole paragraphs, the text would become a mythology of giants lumbering across rivers and stalking through forests, but of course the text only periodically and momentarily breaks out of abstraction into this form of description. It is precisely because this form of description is a widely shared convention that it need not often be sustained over an entire passage but can instead be invoked with a single word or phrase, the fragments of a story whose outlines are familiar to all. Thus, one's own army may become a single gigantic weapon, a spearhead or a hammer, a certain territory or part of the army may become an appendix or an underbelly, each army has an Achilles heel, or a vulnerable hinge or joint or a rear that may be penetrated, two divisions may be attacked where they stand shoulder to shoulder, and so forth. Although a shared convention rather than a construction introduced by a single writer, some are masters of it than others. It is used, for example, with great frequency and agility by B.H. Liddell Hart. Ludendorff's long-cherished idea of a decisive blow against the British in Belgium in World War I becomes a blow that will be delivered or not delivered with his own magnified hands. He had failed to pinch out the campaign buttress on the west. The tactical success of his own blows had been Ludendorff's undoing. He had driven in 3 great wedges, but none had penetrated far enough to sever a vital artery. 25 Whether he is describing the strategy of Alexander, Napoleon, or the Sixth of the Marne, one of the large combatants may begin to enact, with all the grace of slow-motion photography, a dance of shifting weight dispersed across the lift and fall of giant limbs. He first drew the enemy's attention and resources to their left flank, then pressed hard on their right and center. He turned this frustration to ultimate advantage by a pretense of swinging his weight farther to their left, while actually swinging it to their right and center. 26. It should be stressed that this convention, whether occurring in strategic, military, or political writings, arises not out of any attempt to obscure human hurt but out of purposes appropriate to those writings. The convention expresses the fact that the fate of the overall army or overall population, and not the fate of single individuals, will determine the outcome. It also has the virtue of bestowing visibility on events which, because of their scale, are wholly outside visual experience. It is, however, a convention which assists the disappearance of a human body from accounts of the very event that is the most radically embodying event in which human beings ever collectively participate. It is not that injury is wholly omitted, or even that it is, strictly speaking, reinscribed, but rather that it is relocated to a place, the imaginary body of a colossus, where it is no longer recognizable or interpretable. We will respond to the injury, a severed artery in one giant, a massive series of leech bites in another. 27, as an imaginary wound in an imaginary body, despite the fact that that imaginary body is itself made up of thousands of real human bodies, and thus composed of actual, hence woundable, human tissue. The wound thus becomes a way of articulating and vivifying, literally, investing with life, the idea of the strategic vulnerability of an armed forces, and will in most instances, if noticed, be accepted as it is intended, as only a colorful form of description. A colossal severed artery, if anything, works to deflect attention away from rather than call attention to what almost certainly lies only a very short distance behind the surface of that image, a terrifying number of bodies with actually severed arteries. In fact, when this descriptive convention occurs in close proximity to a sentence referring to actual body damage, it tends to appropriate attention away from that sentence since it is itself, by its very scale, so visually compelling and, at the same time, so easy to contemplate. Unlike a real wound, it will not, however visually startling, stupefy us into silence or shame us with the shame of our powerlessness to approach the opened human body and make it not opened as before. Describing the first German use of chlorine gas at Ypres on April 22, 1915, Liddell Hart writes that it left a gap 4 miles wide filled only by the dead and by those who lay suffocating in agony from chlorine gas poisoning. 1 sentence later that 4-mile-wide gap becomes a gap in the jaw of a giant, and the embodied soldiers are now teeth in that jaw. With the aid of gas the Germans had removed the defenders on the north flank of the salient as deftly as if extracting the back teeth from one side of a jaw. The remaining teeth in front and on the south flank of the salient were formed by the Canadian Division, Alderson, nearest the gap, the 28th Division, Bolven, and the 27th Division, Snow, which together comprised Plumer's 5th Corps. The Germans had only to push south for 4 miles to reach Ypres, and loosen all these teeth by pressure from the rear. 28 Similarity, when in Churchill's June 6, 1944 address to the House of Commons he announces and assesses the liberation of Rome, he specifies the body count for the two sides as 20,000 and 25,000 *, but if our attention, or the attention of those originally addressed, does not move to the 45,000 dead it may be because it is still lingering with the striking image that immediately preceded the body count, the image of 8 or 9 German giants, the 8 or 9 divisions who were diverted to Italy and were repulsed, and their teeth broken, by the successful resistance of the Anzio bridgehead forces in the important battle which took place in the middle of February 29. The maimed colossus will typically require neither our sympathy nor our anger nor our shame, and it is often, as here, made to look slightly ludicrous in the midst of its mighty catastrophe. 30. In these first two forms of description, the action of injuring and the injury it accomplishes are invisible, absent from view in the case of omission, and actively escorted out of view in the case of redescription. But they cannot always achieve and maintain invisibility. There were, for example, at the end of World War I 39 million corpses and at the end of World War II between 47 and 55 million corpses, and more remarkable, perhaps, than those forms of description already looked at are the particular vocabularies that arise once the injuries are seen, and that assign them to an accidental, incidental, or subordinate position. Human wounds are not, as earlier, escorted out of view but are instead escorted from the center of view to the margins. There are 4 main paths by which injuring can be relegated to a still visible but marginal position. In the first of these, the injuries and deaths and damage are referred to as a byproduct of war. The term is usually preceded by an adjective: terrible byproduct, necessary byproduct, acceptable byproduct, inevitable byproduct, unacceptable byproduct. Which one appears in a given instance is determined by the particular argument that is being made. But if injury is designated the byproduct, what is the product? Injury is the thing every exhausting piece of strategy and every single weapon is designed to bring into being. It is not something inadvertently produced on the way to producing something else, but is the relentless object of all military activity. Although we may become lost in the intricacies of this helicopter's ability to hover, and that one's inclusion of a particular type of radar, or the M113's ability to move over 600 yards in a given number of seconds less than the ML50, what is being indicated at all times is the relative degree of the object's power to injure, to sight the opponent, to approach and reach the opponent, and to damage the opponent, or the relative degree of its power to remain immune while injuring so that it can go on injuring, hence to sight the opponent, to approach the opponent, to damage the opponent, and to go on damaging the opponent the maximum length of time before it is itself knocked out of the war. So, too, the complexities of strategic decisions are complexities about where best, not necessarily maximally, and how best, not necessarily maximally, to inflict injury, or where and how to inflict injury while keeping one side immune in order to sustain its injury-inflicting powers. It is not the language of production or creation that is false here, for that vocabulary acknowledges the fact that something not in existence, not naturally occurring, was brought into being by conscious human agency and inventiveness. Nor, if one wanted to include within the production metaphor the goals that are exterior to war, example political freedom 31 territorial legitimacy, assertion of authority in a given hemisphere, would it be false to designate injury an intermediate product that somehow will be discussed at a later point, become one day a different product, political freedom. But while it is accurate to designate injury the product of the immediate activity of war, or in the second case, the intermediate product in the long-range outcomes, it is in no case accurate to identify it as the byproduct. One may say, for example, that one's object is to make paper and not to kill trees, but the acres of felled trees are then an intermediate product, actively brought about by concentrated acts of labor, not a byproduct. The language of byproduct denotes accidental, unwanted, unsought, unanticipated, and useless. 32 The last meaning is the most crushing, for while the others are only an abdication of responsibility, the last asserts that the deaths on neither side were centrally useful to whatever it was that was being sought through the war's activity. The only thing more overwhelming than that a human community should have a use for death, the extreme use for that is signaled by the ship from it is needed to it is required, and soldiers understand that it is this use to which they have been summoned, this to which they have consented, that they are going either to die for one's country or to kill for one's country. The only thing more overwhelming than the fact that it will have this use for death is that the community will then disown that use and designate those deaths useless. The millions who stood on the streets of Nagasaki and Dresden, the 20 million Russians who died in World War N, the generation of French and British maimed in World War I, the 57,000 Americans who died in Vietnam, whatever a war's use, whatever its aspirations, whatever its accomplishments, its deeds and outcomes, they have nothing central to do with these dead and injured who are war's byproduct.